Thomas Mitchell stood on the wooden platform of Silver Creek Station, his weathered hands gripping a crumpled letter that had arrived 3 months ago. The autumn wind whipped across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the distant promise of winter. His blue eyes scanned the horizon for the 100th time that day, searching for any sign of dust clouds that might indicate an approaching wagon train. The letter in his hands bore the careful handwriting of Miss Catherine Eleanor Hartwell of Boston, Massachusetts. She had responded to his advertisement in the matrimonial section of the Boston Herald, a simple notice that read, "Honest rancher, 32, seeks virtuous woman for marriage and companionship on Wyoming Territory Ranch. Must be willing to work hard and build a life together. Write to Thomas Mitchell, Silver Creek, Wyoming." Catherine's first letter had arrived like a ray of sunshine in his otherwise solitary existence. Her words painted a picture of a refined but practical young woman of 24, orphaned after her parents died in a carriage accident, left with little more than her education and a strong desire to start fresh in the Western Territories. She wrote of her ability to read and write, her skills in cooking and household management, and, most importantly, her genuine interest in building a meaningful partnership with a good man. Over the course of 6 months, they had exchanged 17 letters. Thomas kept them all in a wooden box on his mantelpiece, tied with a blue ribbon that had come with one of her packages. Through their correspondence, he had learned about her love of books, her gentle humor, and her surprising knowledge of farming from spending summers with her aunt in rural Massachusetts. She had learned about his struggles to build his ranch after the war, his dreams of raising cattle and maybe children, and his deep loneliness in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The plan had been simple. Catherine would travel by train to Cheyenne, then join a wagon train heading north to Silver Creek. The journey should have taken no more than 10 days from the time she left Boston. Her last letter, dated 6 weeks ago, had been filled with excitement and nervous anticipation. She had written about purchasing travel clothes, packing her few precious belongings, and her hopes for their future together. But Catherine Eleanor Hartwell had never arrived. Thomas had made this trip to the station every day for the past month. At first, he told himself the trains were simply delayed, or perhaps she had missed a connection. The frontier was unpredictable, and delays were common. But as days turned into weeks, a cold dread had begun to settle in his chest. The station master, old Pete Hawkins, emerged from the small building that served as both depot and telegraph office. Pete had been running this station since the railroad came through 5 years ago, and he knew every traveler, every shipment, and every piece of mail that passed through Silver Creek. "Still no word, Tom," Pete said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "I sent another telegraph to Cheyenne this morning. They confirmed that a Miss Hartwell bought a ticket for the northbound wagon service 6 weeks ago, but that's where the trail goes cold." Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. "What about the wagon master? Anyone talk to him?" "That's where it gets strange," Pete replied, lowering his voice. "The wagon train she was supposed to be on never made it to Cheyenne. Company called it off last minute due to Indian troubles up north. But here's the peculiar part. They say some passengers had already paid their fares and decided to make the journey with an independent operator." "Independent operator?" "Fellow named Jake Morrison. Runs a small outfit, takes passengers and freight when the big companies won't. Not the most reliable sort, but he knows the territory. Problem is, nobody's seen hide nor hair of Morrison or his wagon for over a month." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Morrison's name was familiar, but not in a good way. The man had a reputation for cutting corners and taking risks that more experienced wagon masters avoided. If Catherine had fallen in with Morrison's group, she could be anywhere between Cheyenne and the Canadian border. "Pete, I need you to send some more telegraphs. Try Fort Laramie, South Pass, anywhere Morrison might have stopped for supplies. And see if you can reach any of the Army outposts. They keep track of civilian movement through Indian Territory." The older man nodded. "I'll do what I can, Tom. But you know as well as I do that there's a lot of empty country between here and there. A small wagon train could disappear easy enough, especially if they ran into trouble." Thomas knew Pete was right, but he couldn't accept it. Not yet. Catherine's letters had revealed a woman of intelligence and spirit, someone who wouldn't give up easily. If she was out there somewhere, he had to find her. The thought of her facing danger alone, perhaps wondering why he hadn't come looking for her, was unbearable. That evening, Thomas rode back to his ranch as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The small cabin he had built with his own hands seemed even more empty than usual. He had spent weeks preparing for Catherine's arrival, adding feminine touches to the rough interior, building furniture, and even planting a small garden behind the house. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a stone fireplace he had constructed from river rocks. 2 bedrooms opened off the main space, one for him, and one that was to have been Catherine's until they were properly married. He had carved a small writing desk for her, knowing from her letters how much she loved to write and keep journals. Thomas lit an oil lamp and sat at his own rough wooden table, spreading out a territorial map he had purchased from a traveling merchant. Using a pencil, he marked Silver Creek and Cheyenne, then began tracing possible routes a wagon train might take. The most direct path led north through Fort Laramie, across the North Platte River, and then northwest through increasingly wild country. But Morrison was known for taking shortcuts, often leaving the established trails to save time or avoid toll stations. There were dozens of possible routes he might have chosen, each one leading through hundreds of miles of prairie, mountains, and river crossings where anything could happen. As Thomas studied the map, memories of his own journey west after the war came flooding back. He had seen wagon trains destroyed by storms, attacks, disease, and simple bad luck. He had witnessed the bones of travelers bleaching in the sun, their dreams of a better life ending in unmarked graves beside forgotten trails. But he had also seen the incredible resilience of frontier women. During his time as a cavalry scout, he had encountered women who had walked hundreds of miles after losing their wagons, who had fought off attackers with nothing but determination and a rifle, who had nursed their families through disasters that would have broken lesser spirits. If Catherine was anything like the woman her letter suggested, she would be fighting to survive whatever had befallen Morrison's wagon train. Thomas just had to find her before it was too late. The next morning brought the first real break in the case. Pete had received a response to one of his telegraphs from Fort Laramie. A small wagon train, led by Jake Morrison, had passed through their checkpoint 5 weeks ago, heading northwest toward the Oregon Trail. The commanding officer remembered the group because one of the passengers had caused a scene at the sutler's store. According to the telegraph, a young woman in the group had tried to send a letter back east, but had been prevented from doing so by Morrison, who claimed they couldn't afford any delays. The woman had been described as well-dressed despite the journey's hardships, with dark hair and an Eastern accent. Thomas saddled his horse before dawn the next day, packing supplies for a long journey. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, had carried him through 3 years of Indian campaigns and knew the territory as well as any animal could. If he pushed hard and rode smart, he could reach Fort Laramie in 4 days. Before leaving, he stopped by the home of his nearest neighbor, Sarah Walsh, a widow who ran a small farm with the help of her 2 teenage sons. Sarah was one of the few people in the territory who knew about his correspondence with Catherine, and she had been almost as excited as Thomas about the upcoming marriage. "I'm going after her, Sarah," Thomas explained as she served him coffee in her simple kitchen. "Something's happened to that wagon train, and I can't just sit here wondering." Sarah Walsh was a practical woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children on the frontier. She understood better than most the dangers that faced travelers in the territory, but she also understood the kind of man Thomas Mitchell was. "You'll find her, Tom," she said simply. "And when you do, you bring her here first. A woman who's been through whatever she's been through will need some gentle care before she's ready to start her new life." Thomas nodded gratefully. Sarah's offer meant more than she knew. The prospect of nursing Catherine back to health in his rough bachelor cabin had been one of his many worries. As Thomas rode northwest from his ranch, the landscape gradually changed from rolling grassland to more rugged country. The first day took him through familiar territory, past homesteads and small settlements where he occasionally stopped to ask if anyone had seen Morrison's wagon train. Most people he talked to remembered Morrison. He had a distinctive red beard and a loud voice that carried for miles across the prairie. Several witnesses confirmed that he had passed through with 3 wagons and about a dozen passengers, including at least 2 women. But that had been over a month ago, and no one had seen them since. On the second day, Thomas entered less settled country. The homesteads became fewer and farther between, separated by vast expanses of grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. This was the kind of country where a small group of travelers could disappear without a trace, where weather, Indians, or simple accident could end lives without anyone ever knowing what had happened. Thomas made good time, covering nearly 40 miles each day. Buck was a strong horse with tremendous endurance, and Thomas himself had learned during his military service how to travel fast and light across difficult terrain. He carried minimal supplies, jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a small amount of grain for Buck. At night, he made cold camps without fires, not wanting to attract unwanted attention. The frontier was becoming more settled, but there were still renegade bands of Indians and white outlaws who would kill a lone traveler for his horse and gear. On the third day, Thomas encountered his first real clue. At a trading post beside a river crossing, the proprietor remembered Morrison's group clearly. They had stopped to water their animals and purchase supplies, but the wagon master had seemed nervous and eager to move on. Kept looking over his shoulder, the trader recalled, like he was expecting trouble. The passengers seemed unhappy too, especially the women. One of them tried to buy writing paper, said she needed to get word to someone that she was all right. Morrison wouldn't let her do it, said they didn't have time for foolishness. The trader's description of the woman matched what Thomas knew of Catherine. Well-educated, determined, and clearly frustrated by Morrison's restrictions. The knowledge that she had been alive and trying to communicate just 3 weeks ago filled Thomas with both hope and increased urgency. Which way did they head when they left here? Thomas asked. The trader pointed northwest, toward a range of low hills that marked the beginning of more dangerous country. Morrison said they were taking the Bridger cutoff, trying to save time. I told him it wasn't a good idea with passengers, especially women, but he said he knew what he was doing. Thomas knew the Bridger cutoff by reputation. It was a shortcut used by experienced mountain men and freight haulers, but it involved river crossings, steep grades, and passage through territory where hostile Indians were known to operate. It was not a route any responsible wagon master would choose with paying passengers aboard. Fort Laramie appeared on the horizon late on the fourth day, its adobe walls and wooden buildings a welcome sight after days of empty prairie. The fort served as a crucial supply point and communication hub for travelers heading west, and Thomas hoped the commanding officer would have more detailed information about Morrison's group. Major Harrison, the fort's commander, was a career soldier who had spent 15 years on the frontier. He received Thomas in his office, a sparse room decorated only with maps and a photograph of his family back east. Morrison's group? The major said, consulting a ledger book. Yes, I remember them well. They arrived here in poor condition. One wagon had a broken axle, several people were sick, and morale was terrible. Morrison wanted to press on immediately, but I insisted they rest for 2 days while repairs were made. What about the passengers? Was there a young woman from Boston? There were 2 women, Major Harrison replied. One was an older widow traveling to meet her son in Oregon. The other was younger, well-spoken, clearly educated. She approached me privately, said she was concerned about Morrison's judgment, and asked if she could arrange different transportation. Thomas leaned forward. What did you tell her? I explained that Morrison was her legal guardian as wagon master, and that I couldn't interfere with a civilian contract. But I did advise her to stay alert and be prepared to take care of herself if things went badly. The major paused, studying Thomas's face. I take it this young woman is important to you? She's my intended bride, Thomas explained. We've been corresponding for months. She was supposed to arrive in Silver Creek 6 weeks ago. Major Harrison's expression grew grave. Mr. Mitchell, I have to tell you that I advised against Morrison's planned route. He intended to follow the Bridger cutoff north to the Snake River, then cut west toward Oregon. It's dangerous country, especially for a small, poorly equipped party. But you let them go? I couldn't legally stop them. Morrison had valid contracts with his passengers, and they were civilian travelers. All I could do was warn them and offer them escort if they waited for the next military patrol heading that direction. Morrison refused. He said he was behind schedule and couldn't afford delays. The young woman you're asking about looked very unhappy when they pulled out, but she stayed with the group. I remember thinking she was either very brave or very foolish. Thomas spent the night at the fort, taking advantage of Major Harrison's offer of a hot meal and a real bed. Over dinner in the officers' mess, he learned more about the dangers that might have befallen Catherine's group. Several officers had experience with the Bridger cutoff and the country beyond. They spoke of difficult river crossings where wagons could be swept away, mountain passes where early snow could trap travelers, and Indian bands were becoming increasingly hostile as more settlers moved through their territory. But they also spoke of remarkable survival stories, travelers who had endured incredible hardships and lived to tell about it. Thomas held on to those stories as he lay in his borrowed bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying not to imagine all the things that could have gone wrong. The next morning, Major Harrison provided Thomas with a map marked with Morrison's intended route and the locations of water sources, trading posts, and known danger spots. He also assigned a young lieutenant named Peters to accompany Thomas for the first day's ride, since Peters needed to deliver dispatches to an outpost along the same route. "If you find them, Mr. Mitchell," the major said as they prepared to depart, "remember that survival is more important than pride. If that young woman is alive, she may have had to make difficult choices to stay that way. Don't judge her too harshly for whatever she's had to do." Thomas understood the major's meaning. Frontier survival often required compromises that Eastern sensibilities couldn't easily accept. If Catherine was alive, she might have had to do things or associate with people that her proper Boston upbringing never could have prepared her for. As Thomas rode northwest from Fort Laramie with Lieutenant Peters, he carried with him a mixture of hope and dread. Every mile brought him closer to answers, but also closer to the possibility that those answers might be too terrible to bear. The vast Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful and deadly in equal measure, holding somewhere within its immensity the woman he had come to love through her letters and the truth about what had happened to her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills as Thomas Mitchell and Lieutenant Peters rode northwest from Fort Laramie. The terrain grew increasingly rugged with each mile, transforming from gentle grasslands in a broken country marked by deep ravines, rocky outcroppings, and patches of thick timber that could hide dangers both natural and human. Lieutenant Peters, a fresh-faced young officer from Ohio, had been assigned to the Western Territories only 3 months earlier. He rode with the nervous energy of someone still adjusting to frontier life, constantly scanning the horizon and starting at every unusual sound. His mission was to deliver dispatches to a remote outpost called Pine Ridge Station, located along the route that Morrison's wagon train would have taken. "Tell me about this Morrison fellow," Thomas asked as they navigated their horses around a cluster of boulders. The major seemed to know him by reputation. Peters adjusted his cavalry hat against the wind. "Jake Morrison's been operating wagon trains through this territory for about 5 years. He's got a legal license and everything, but he's known for cutting corners. Takes routes other wagon masters won't touch, carries passengers other companies won't accept, and charges lower rates than the established outfits." "That doesn't necessarily make him dishonest," Thomas observed. "No, but it makes him desperate," Peters replied. "A desperate man makes poor decisions, especially when he's responsible for other people's lives." Morrison's had 3 major incidents in the past 2 years: a wagon lost in a river crossing, a group attacked by bandits because he took an unprotected route, and a party that got snowed in and nearly starved because he pushed too late into the season. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. The image of Catherine, trusting and vulnerable, placing her life in the hands of such a man filled him with anger and fear in equal measure. They rode in companionable silence for several hours, following a well-marked trail that wound through increasingly wild country. By midday, they had climbed into hills covered with pine and aspen trees, their leaves just beginning to turn golden with the approach of autumn. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of snow. At a small clearing beside a creek, they stopped to rest their horses and eat a cold lunch of hardtack and jerky. Peters consulted his map and pointed to their location. "We're making good time," he said. "Pine Ridge Station should be just over that next ridge. If Morrison's group passed this way, the soldiers there would have seen them. And if they didn't pass this way," Peters folded his map carefully, "then they either took a different route or they never made it this far." The thought hung heavy between them as they remounted and continued their journey. Thomas found himself studying the ground more carefully, looking for any sign of wagon wheels or horses' hooves that might indicate recent passage. But the trail they followed was well used by military patrols, freight wagons, and individual travelers. Any tracks from Morrison's group would have been obliterated weeks ago. Pine Ridge Station turned out to be a small cluster of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, situated on a bluff overlooking a broad valley. The American flag snapped briskly in the wind above the main gate, and smoke rose from several chimneys. It was the kind of isolated outpost that served as both military base and civilian refuge in the vast wilderness of the Wyoming Territory. Sergeant O'Malley, the ranking non-commissioned officer at the station, was a grizzled veteran with 20 years of frontier service. He greeted Lieutenant Peters with the casual respect of an experienced soldier dealing with a green officer, then turned his attention to Thomas with obvious curiosity. "Civilian looking for Morrison's wagon train?" O'Malley mused after Thomas explained his mission. "You're the second person to come through here asking about that group." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Someone else has been looking for them." "Fellow named Henderson came through about 2 weeks ago. Said he was a deputy marshal from Cheyenne, tracking Morrison for some kind of fraud charges. Seemed mighty interested in catching up with that wagon train." Lieutenant Peters frowned. "Did you see this Henderson's credentials?" "Looked official enough to me," O'Malley replied. "Had a badge and papers and everything. But then, I'm no expert on such things. Out here, a man's word and his character matter more than paperwork." Thomas exchanged glances with Peters. The presence of a law enforcement officer tracking Morrison added a new and troubling dimension to the situation. If Morrison was fleeing fraud charges, he might be even more desperate and unpredictable than anyone had realized. "Did Morrison's group pass through here?" Thomas asked. "They did indeed," O'Malley confirmed. "Came through about 3 weeks ago, in pretty poor condition. 2 of their wagons had broken wheels, several passengers were sick, and their supplies were running low. Morrison wanted to push on immediately, but I convinced him to rest here for a day while repairs were made." "What about the passengers? Was there a young woman from the east?" O'Malley's weathered face grew thoughtful. 2 women in the group. The older one was clearly used to hard travel, but the younger one stood out. Well-dressed despite the journey, spoke like she had education. She approached me privately, said she was concerned about Morrison's judgment. "What did you tell her?" "Same thing Major Harrison probably told her at Laramie, that Morrison was responsible for the group's safety, and all I could do was offer advice. But I did tell her to keep her wits about her, and be ready to take care of herself if things went bad." Thomas felt a mixture of pride and concern. Catherine was clearly trying to take control of her situation, but there was only so much a lone woman could do in the wilderness, especially when dependent on others for transportation and protection. "Which direction did they head when they left?" Peters asked. O'Malley pointed northwest, toward a gap between 2 mountains. "Morrison said they were heading for Willow Creek Pass, then down into the Snake River Valley. It's rough country, but passable if you know what you're doing and have decent equipment. And if you don't?" The sergeant's expression grew grim. "Then you could find yourself in a world of trouble real quick. There are river crossings where the current can sweep away a wagon, mountain passes where bad weather can trap you for days, and stretches of country where hostile Indians operate." Lieutenant Peters completed his business at Pine Ridge Station while Thomas gathered more information about Morrison's route and the dangers that lay ahead. The soldiers at the outpost were experienced frontiersmen who knew the territory intimately, and they provided valuable details about water sources, potential camping spots, and areas to avoid. One of the soldiers, a scout named Charlie Running Bear, who was half Sioux, offered particularly useful intelligence. "Bad country ahead," he said in his careful English. "Crow warriors angry about wagon trains passing through their hunting grounds. They've been watching the trails, looking for small groups they can attack without fear of army retaliation." "Have you seen any sign of trouble recently?" Thomas asked. Charlie's dark eyes grew troubled. 3 days ago, found remains of small camp about 20 miles north of here. Looked like travelers, but hard to tell what happened. Could have been Indians, could have been bandits, could have been accident." The news sent a chill through Thomas. If Morrison's group had run into hostile Indians or white outlaws, Catherine could be dead, captured, or worse. But he forced himself to remain calm and focused. Until he knew for certain what had happened, he had to assume she was alive and continue his search. Lieutenant Peters prepared to return to Fort Laramie the next morning, but before departing, he made Thomas an offer that was both generous and practical. "I can't officially accompany you further," Peters explained, "but I can provide you with a letter of introduction to the military commanders in the region. If you run into serious trouble, that letter might help you get assistance." Thomas accepted the letter gratefully and also took advantage of the opportunity to send a telegraph back to Pete Hawkins in Silver Creek, updating him on the search and asking him to continue monitoring for any word about Morrison's group. The message was necessarily brief, following Morrison's trail northwest from Fort Laramie. Group passed Pine Ridge Station 3 weeks ago, heading for Willow Creek Pass. Deputy Marshall also tracking them. Will continue search. Notify if any word received. T. Mitchell. As Peters rode south toward Fort Laramie, Thomas continued northwest, following the route O'Malley had described. The country grew steadily wilder and more challenging, with steep climbs, rocky descents, and frequent stream crossings that would have been difficult for heavily loaded wagons. Thomas found himself constantly alert for signs of the wagon train's passage. Here and there he spotted evidence of their struggle. Broken wagon parts discarded beside the trail, areas where multiple teams had been used to pull wagons up steep grades, and camping spots marked by the cold ashes of old fires. On the second day after leaving Pine Ridge Station, Thomas encountered his first clear sign that something had gone seriously wrong with Morrison's expedition. At a river crossing where the trail forded a fast-flowing stream, he found the remains of a wagon wheel embedded in the muddy bank. The wheel was clearly broken beyond repair, its iron tire twisted, and several spokes snapped completely through. Nearby, Thomas discovered other debris, pieces of canvas, broken harness leather, and scattered personal belongings that had been abandoned when their owners were forced to lighten their load. Among the debris, Thomas found something that made his heart race. Partially buried in the mud was a small leather-bound book with water-damaged pages. When he carefully opened it, he recognized Catherine's handwriting immediately. It was the diary she had mentioned in her letters, the journal where she recorded her thoughts and experiences. Most of the pages were too damaged by water to read clearly, but Thomas could make out fragments of entries describing the journey west. Catherine's words painted a picture of increasing hardship and growing concern about Morrison's leadership. One passage, written in her careful script, was still partially legible. Morrison grows more desperate each day. The other passengers are beginning to question his judgment, and I fear we have made a terrible mistake in trusting our lives to this man. If something happens to us out here, I pray that Thomas will somehow learn the truth. Thomas carefully placed the diary in his saddlebags, treating it like the precious artifact it was. The fact that Catherine had been thinking of him, even in her darkest moments, filled him with both love and determination. She was counting on him to find her, and he would not fail her. The river crossing itself told a story of disaster and heroic effort. From the tracks and debris scattered along both banks, Thomas could piece together what had happened. Morrison's group had attempted to ford the stream during high water, probably after recent rains had swollen the current beyond safe levels. One wagon had clearly been caught by the current and overturned, spilling its contents into the rushing water. The wheel Thomas had found was probably from that wagon, broken when it struck rocks in the stream bed. But the other wagons had apparently made it across, suggesting that most of the group had survived the accident. Thomas followed the trail on the far side of the stream, which was easier to read since fewer travelers used this more difficult route. The remaining wagons had clearly struggled through muddy ground, their wheels leaving deep ruts that were still visible weeks later. More ominously, Thomas began to notice signs that the group was being followed. Mixed in with the wagon tracks and horse prints were the unshod hoof prints of Indian ponies, following the same route, but staying slightly off the main trail. Charlie Running Bear's warnings about hostile Crow warriors echoed in Thomas's mind as he studied the tracks. The Indians were clearly shadowing Morrison's group, probably waiting for an opportunity to attack when the travelers were most vulnerable. Thomas pushed Buck harder, covering as much ground as possible during daylight hours. The trail led steadily northwest through increasingly mountainous country, following river valleys when possible, but sometimes climbing over ridges that offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. On the third day after leaving Pine Ridge Station, Thomas crested a hill and saw something that made his blood run cold. In the valley below, a thin column of smoke was rising from what appeared to be the remains of a wagon train. Spurring Buck down the hillside, Thomas approached the scene with his rifle ready and his senses alert for any sign of danger. What he found was a scene of devastation that told a clear story of tragedy and violence. 3 wagons had been arranged in a defensive circle beside a small stream, but their canvas tops were burned away and their wooden frames charred black. Scattered around the campsite were the belongings of the travelers: clothes, cooking utensils, tools, and personal items that had been looted through and then discarded. Several graves had been hastily dug near the edge of the camp, marked with crude wooden crosses, but no names. Thomas counted 5 graves, which suggested that some of Morrison's group had survived whatever had befallen them here. As Thomas searched through the debris, looking for any clue to Catherine's fate, he found evidence that the attack had been fierce but brief. Arrows embedded in wagon sides showed that Indians had been involved, but there were also bullet holes that suggested the travelers had been armed and had fought back. More importantly, Thomas found signs that some of the group had escaped the attack. Tracks led away from the destroyed camp, heading west toward the mountains. The tracks included both horses and people on foot, suggesting that survivors had fled with whatever transportation they could manage. Thomas studied the escape route carefully, trying to determine how many people had fled and in what condition. The tracks were several days old and partially obscured by wind and weather, but he could make out at least 4 horses and possibly 6 or 7 people on foot. One set of footprints caught his attention because they were smaller than the others and showed signs of someone struggling to keep up. The prints suggested a woman, and Thomas allowed himself to hope that Catherine might have been among the survivors who escaped the massacre. As the sun began to set, Thomas made camp upwind from the destroyed wagons, not wanting to spend the night surrounded by the smell of death and destruction. He built a small fire and prepared a simple meal, but his mind was focused entirely on the decision he faced. The survivors' trail led west into some of the most dangerous country in the Wyoming Territory. It was mountainous terrain where weather could change rapidly, where water sources were scarce, and where hostile Indians were known to operate. Following that trail would be dangerous for a lone man, but it was the only lead he had. Thomas thought about Catherine's diary, hidden safely in his saddlebags, and the words she had written about counting on him to find the truth. She had placed her trust in him completely, first through their correspondence, and then through her decision to travel west to marry him. As he sat beside his campfire, staring into the flames and listening to the wind whistle through the burned wagon frames, Thomas made his decision. Tomorrow he would follow the survivors' trail, no matter where it led or how dangerous it became. Catherine was out there somewhere, probably wounded and certainly terrified, counting on him to find her. The last thing Thomas did before sleep was to take out one of Catherine's letters and read it by firelight. Her words about building a life together, about facing whatever challenges the frontier might bring, gave him strength and resolve for the difficult journey that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and new challenges, but it might also bring him closer to the woman he loved. Thomas fell asleep with Catherine's letter pressed against his chest and his rifle within easy reach, ready for whatever the morning might bring. Holmes woke before dawn to the sound of Buck nickering nervously. The horse was staring intently toward the tree line, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring. Thomas grabbed his rifle and crouched low, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. For several tense minutes he watched and listened. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the burned wagon frames and the distant call of a night bird. But Buck continued to act agitated, and Thomas had learned during his cavalry days to trust his horse's instincts. Moving carefully, Thomas saddled Buck and packed his gear while keeping watch on the surrounding forest. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, he spotted what had alarmed his horse. Fresh hoofprints circled his campsite, made during the night by unshod ponies. The Indians had found him, but for some reason had chosen not to attack. Perhaps they were simply scouting, or maybe they respected his skill as a tracker and warrior. Thomas had fought alongside Indian scouts during his military service and knew that many tribes valued courage above all other virtues. Regardless of their motives, the message was clear. He was being watched. Thomas checked his weapons carefully and made sure his ammunition was easily accessible before beginning to follow the survivors' trail west from the destroyed wagon camp. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing steadily into foothills covered with pine and aspen. The tracks were easier to follow here because the soft forest floor held impressions better than the rocky ground near the river. Thomas could see that the survivors were struggling. Their pace was slow and irregular, with frequent stops that suggested injured or exhausted people. Discarded items along the trail told a story of people being forced to abandon possessions as they became too heavy to carry. About mid-morning, Thomas found the first clear evidence that Catherine was among the survivors. Caught on a thorny bush beside the trail was a piece of blue fabric that matched the description of a dress Catherine had mentioned in one of her letters. The fabric was torn and stained with what looked like dried blood, but its presence confirmed that she had passed this way alive. The discovery filled Thomas with both hope and urgency. Catherine was ahead of him somewhere, but she was clearly injured and in desperate circumstances. He pushed Buck harder, knowing that every hour might be critical to her survival. As the day wore on, the trail began to tell a more complex story. The group of survivors was breaking apart, with some people continuing west while others turned north toward what Thomas recognized as an old trapping route. The divisions suggested disagreement about their destination, or perhaps some people were too injured to continue. Thomas faced a crucial decision. The larger group had continued west, but the northern trail showed signs of at least two people, one of whom might be a woman based on the size of the footprints. Following the wrong trail could cost precious time, but following both was impossible. He chose to follow the northern trail, partly because it led toward a trading post he knew about, and partly because something about those footprints reminded him of the smaller prints he had noticed at the destroyed wagon camp. The northern trail proved to be a good choice. Within 2 hours, Thomas found a campsite where someone had made a fire and spent at least one night. Scattered around the cold ashes were clear signs of a woman's presence. Hairpins, a torn piece of petticoat that had been used as a bandage, and, most importantly, pages from Catherine's diary that had been torn out and apparently used to start the fire. Thomas carefully gathered the partially burned pages, hoping to piece together more of Catherine's story. Most were too damaged to read, but one fragment contained words that made his heart race. "Thomas, if you find this, I am alive but hurt. Morrison is dead. Following the creek north toward the old fort. Pray God you can track us." The message was clearly intended for him, which meant Catherine believed he would come looking for her and was leaving clues to help him follow. The reference to the old fort probably meant Fort Bridger, an abandoned military post that had been converted into a trading station. Thomas remounted Buck and followed the trail with renewed determination. The tracks led along a creek that wound through a narrow valley between steep hills. The going was easier here, and the survivors had apparently made better time once they reached the level ground beside the water. Late in the afternoon, Thomas caught his first glimpse of other travelers. Smoke was rising from a campsite about a mile ahead, and he could see the movement of people and horses around a fire. Moving carefully and keeping Buck quiet, Thomas worked his way closer to observe the camp before revealing himself. What he saw through his spyglass made his blood boil. 3 men were sitting around the fire, and 2 of them were clearly not survivors from Morrison's wagon train. They were rough-looking characters dressed in buckskins and armed with rifles and pistols. The 3rd man appeared to be Henderson, the deputy marshal who had been tracking Morrison. More importantly, Thomas could see 2 women near the camp. One was an older woman who seemed to be cooking over the fire, but the other was sitting apart from the group with her hands apparently bound. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that she matched Catherine's description. Thomas spent the rest of the daylight hours observing the camp and planning his approach. The 2 rough men were clearly outlaws or renegades who had somehow joined forces with Henderson. The deputy marshal's presence suggested that this was not a rescue situation, but something much more sinister. As darkness fell, Thomas worked his way closer to the camp, leaving Buck tied securely to a tree about a quarter-mile away. He moved with all the stealth he had learned during his scouting days, using the sound of the creek to mask his approach. When he was close enough to hear conversation around the fire, Thomas learned the full scope of the situation. Henderson was not a legitimate deputy marshal, but an outlaw who had been tracking Morrison to steal money the wagon master had embezzled from previous clients. The 2 other men, whom Henderson called Jake and Charlie, were his partners in the scheme. "Should have killed them all back at the wagon camp," Jake was saying. "Keeping prisoners is just asking for trouble. We need the women alive for now," Henderson replied. "The old one knows where Morrison hid the money, and the young one might be worth something as ransom. Her letters suggest she comes from a wealthy Eastern family." Thomas realized with horror that the outlaws had been reading Catherine's correspondence, probably taken from Morrison's belongings after the attack on the wagon train. They had learned about her background and were planning to use her for ransom or worse. What about the other survivors? Charlie asked. They got away clean and could bring soldiers. They're on foot in hostile country with no supplies, Henderson said dismissively. The Indians will get them before they reach help, and even if they don't, we'll be long gone with the money. Thomas had heard enough. These men were responsible for the massacre at the Wagon camp, and were holding Catherine against her will. The older woman was probably the widow who had been traveling to meet her son in Oregon, now being forced to reveal information about Morrison's hidden funds. Working his way around the camp perimeter, Thomas positioned himself where he could see Catherine clearly. She was sitting with her back against a tree, her hands bound with rope, and her dress torn and dirty. But she was alive and alert, and Thomas could see the intelligence in her eyes as she watched her captors and looked for opportunities to escape. The sight of Catherine filled Thomas with a mixture of rage and determination. She was exactly as he had imagined her from her letters, beautiful, dignified, and clearly unbroken despite her terrible ordeal. The fact that these animals had put their hands on her made Thomas want to charge into the camp with guns blazing. But years of military experience had taught him patience and tactical thinking. 3 armed men in a prepared position could easily kill him before he could rescue Catherine. He needed a better plan, one that would ensure her safety while dealing with the outlaws. As Thomas watched and planned, he noticed that the camp routine followed a predictable pattern. Henderson and Jake took turns standing guard while the third man slept. The guard walked a circuit around the camp perimeter, but he stayed close to the fire and didn't venture far into the darkness. Around midnight, Thomas saw his opportunity. Charlie was on guard duty and had settled down near the fire to stay warm. Henderson and Jake were sleeping in their bedrolls, and the 2 women were secured near the creek bank where they couldn't easily escape. Moving like a shadow, Thomas worked his way to a position directly behind Catherine. When he was close enough to touch her, he placed his hand gently over her mouth and whispered directly in her ear. "Catherine, don't make a sound. I'm Thomas Mitchell. I've come to get you out of here." Thomas felt Catherine's body stiffen with shock, then relax as his words registered. She nodded slightly to show she understood, and Thomas carefully cut the ropes binding her hands with his hunting knife. "Can you move quietly?" he whispered. Catherine nodded again, and Thomas began leading her slowly away from the camp toward the creek. They moved one step at a time, placing each foot carefully and freezing whenever a twig snapped or Charlie stirred near the fire. It took nearly an hour to move 100 yards, but they finally reached the creek bank where they could use the sound of flowing water to mask their movement. Thomas helped Catherine wade across the shallow stream, supporting her when she stumbled on the slippery rocks. On the far side of the creek, they were temporarily safe, but still in extreme danger. The outlaws would discover Catherine's absence as soon as the guard changed, probably within an hour or 2. They needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves, and the camp before daylight revealed their trail. "Can you ride?" Thomas whispered as they made their way toward where Buck was tied. "I think so," Catherine replied, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. "I'm hurt, but not badly. Thomas, I can't believe you found me. I thought I was going to die out here." "You're safe now," Thomas said, though he knew they were still in tremendous danger. "We need to get moving before they discover you're gone." Buck greeted them with a soft nicker that Thomas quickly silenced. The horse seemed to sense the urgency of the situation and stood quietly while Thomas helped Catherine into the saddle. She was weak and clearly in pain, but she managed to stay upright as Thomas swung up behind her. "What about Mrs. Patterson?" Catherine whispered, referring to the older woman still held captive at the camp. Thomas had been wondering about the same thing. Every instinct told him to flee immediately with Catherine, but leaving an innocent woman in the hands of those animals went against everything he believed in. Where exactly did Morrison hide the money Henderson is looking for? Thomas asked. "Mrs. Patterson told me it's buried near an old cabin about 5 miles north of here," Catherine replied. Morrison showed her the location before the attack, in case something happened to him. Thomas made a quick decision that was both tactically sound and morally necessary. "We're going to get that money and use it as bait to free Mrs. Patterson. Do you think you can show me where the cabin is?" Catherine nodded, though Thomas could feel her trembling with exhaustion. "I think so. Mrs. Patterson described the landmarks to me." They rode north through the darkness, following the creek and staying alert for any sounds of pursuit. Catherine directed them toward higher ground, where she remembered Mrs. Patterson mentioning distinctive rock formations that marked the way to Morrison's hiding place. As they rode, Catherine told Thomas what had happened to the wagon train. Morrison had indeed been embezzling money from his clients, and when Henderson and his gang caught up with the group, the wagon master had tried to fight rather than surrender the funds. The attack had been swift and brutal. Morrison and 4 other passengers were killed in the fighting, while Catherine, Mrs. Patterson, and 2 other survivors had fled into the mountains. The other survivors had continued west, hoping to reach Fort Bridger, while Catherine and Mrs. Patterson had been captured by Henderson's gang the next day. Morrison was a fool and a thief, Catherine said quietly, but he didn't deserve to die like that. Neither did the others. Thomas felt Catherine lean back against him as exhaustion began to overcome her adrenaline. She had been through an ordeal that would have broken many people, but she was still thinking clearly and concerned about others. Her letters hadn't lied about her character. Dawn was beginning to break when they found the old cabin Morrison had used as his hiding place. It was a tumble-down structure that had probably been built by trappers decades earlier, now mostly reclaimed by the forest. But the landmarks Mrs. Patterson had described were all in place. Thomas helped Catherine down from Buck and then began searching for the buried money. Morrison had apparently chosen his hiding spot well, a depression behind the cabin that was protected from rain and concealed by fallen logs. Using his knife and bare hands, Thomas dug until he struck something solid. The cache contained several leather pouches filled with gold coins and paper money, probably worth several $1,000s in total. It was more money than Thomas had ever seen in one place. That's it, Catherine confirmed. Morrison showed Mrs. Patterson this exact spot. He said it was his insurance policy in case things went bad. Thomas repacked the money carefully and secured it in his saddlebags. The next phase of his plan was the most dangerous, returning to Henderson's camp and using the money to negotiate for Mrs. Patterson's release. But first, Catherine needed rest and medical attention. Thomas could see that she was running on pure willpower, and he didn't want to risk her life further if there was an alternative. There's a cave system about a mile from here, Thomas said, studying the surrounding terrain. You can hide there while I go back for Mrs. Patterson. No, Catherine said firmly. We go together or not at all. Mrs. Patterson stayed with me when she could have escaped alone. I won't abandon her now. Thomas looked into Catherine's eyes and saw the determination that had carried her through her ordeal. She was exhausted and injured, but her spirit was unbroken. This was the woman he had fallen in love with through her letters, and seeing her courage firsthand only deepened his respect and affection. All right, Thomas said, but we do this my way. You stay hidden while I negotiate. If things go wrong, you take Buck and ride for Fort Bridger as fast as you can. Catherine agreed, and they began making their way back toward Henderson's camp. The sun was fully up now, and Thomas knew the outlaws would have discovered Catherine's absence. They would be looking for tracks and preparing for pursuit. As they approached the camp, Thomas could hear angry voices and the sound of men moving around frantically. Henderson was shouting orders at his partners, clearly furious about losing his most valuable prisoner. Thomas left Catherine hidden in a grove of trees with instructions to wait for his signal. If he didn't return within an hour, she was to head north toward Fort Bridger and not look back. Taking a deep breath and checking his weapons one final time, Thomas walked openly into Henderson's camp with his hands visible but ready to draw. It was time to end this nightmare and rescue Mrs. Patterson, whatever the cost. Thomas Mitchell walked into Henderson's camp with the confidence of a man who held all the cards, though inside his heart was racing. The 3 outlaws spun toward him with weapons drawn, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. Henderson's face was twisted with rage, while Jake and Charlie looked nervous and trigger-happy. Easy, gentlemen, Thomas said, keeping his hands visible but positioned to draw his pistol quickly. I'm here to make a deal, not start a fight. Henderson stepped forward, his false badge glinting in the morning sunlight. You're the one who took our prisoner. Where is she? Safe, Thomas replied calmly. And she'll stay that way if you're smart about this. I have something you want, and you have something I want. Let's see if we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone. Mrs. Patterson was sitting near the dead fire, her hands bound and her dress torn from rough treatment. She looked up at Thomas with a mixture of hope and fear, clearly recognizing him as a potential rescuer but afraid to believe he could succeed against 3 armed men. "What makes you think you have anything we want?" Jake snarled, his rifle pointed in Thomas's direction. Thomas reached slowly into his saddlebag and withdrew one of Morrison's money pouches, letting the morning light catch the gold coins inside. The effect on the outlaws was immediate. Their eyes widened with greed, and Henderson actually licked his lips. "Morrison's cash," Thomas said simply. "All of it. More money than you could steal in 10 years of robbing wagon trains." Henderson's cunning mind was clearly working fast. "How do I know that's real? Could be fool's gold or worthless coins." Thomas tossed the pouch at Henderson's feet. "Check for yourself. But know that there's a lot more where that came from, and you'll never find it without my help." Henderson examined the coins carefully while his partners watched with obvious excitement. Thomas could see the greed warring with suspicion in the outlaw's face as he calculated the potential profit against the risks involved. "Where's the rest of it?" Henderson demanded. "That depends on whether you're interested in making a deal or dying here in the wilderness," Thomas replied. "Because those are your only 2 choices." Charlie nervously adjusted his grip on his rifle. "Henderson, this could be a trap. Maybe we should just kill him and torture the information out of the old woman." "You could try," Thomas said conversationally, "but Mrs. Patterson doesn't know the exact location. Only Morrison knew that, and he's dead. The girl I rescued was the only one he told, and she's safely out of your reach." It was a calculated bluff, since Catherine had actually told him where the money was hidden. But Henderson didn't know that, and Thomas was counting on the outlaw's greed to overcome his caution. "What kind of deal are you proposing?" Henderson asked finally. Thomas gestured toward Mrs. Patterson. "Simple exchange. You release the lady unharmed, and I'll take you to Morrison's cash. You get the money, she gets her freedom, and everyone walks away alive." "What about the girl?" "She's worth a fortune in ransom." "The girl is off the table," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "Try to pursue her, and you'll find yourself dealing with the United States Army. She managed to send a message to Fort Bridger before I found her, and cavalry patrols are already looking for survivors from your massacre." Another bluff, but a believable one. Henderson knew that massacring civilians would bring swift military retaliation, and the last thing he wanted was to attract Army attention to his operations. Jake was growing impatient with the negotiations. "Henderson, this is taking too long. Let's just kill him and take our chances finding the money ourselves, and spend the next 6 months digging holes all over this territory." Thomas asked. Morrison was clever about hiding his stash. Without the exact location, you'd never find it. Henderson held up a hand to silence Jake, his criminal mind still calculating odds and profits. Thomas could see that greed was winning, but the outlaw was too experienced to accept the deal without safeguards. "Here's my counteroffer," Henderson said. "You take us to the money now, and if it's really there, we let the old woman go. But we keep you as insurance until we're safely away from this territory." Thomas shook his head. "No deal. Mrs. Patterson goes free first, or there's no arrangement." "Then we're at an impasse," Henderson said, drawing his pistol. "Jake, Charlie, get ready to dash." Thomas's hand moved like lightning, drawing his Colt .45 and firing before Henderson could finish his sentence. The outlaw leader spun and fell, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. Before Jake and Charlie could react, Thomas had rolled behind a fallen log and was drawing a bead on Charlie with his rifle. "Drop your weapons now, or the next shot goes through your heart." The 2 remaining outlaws found themselves in an impossible position. Their leader was wounded and helpless, and they were facing a man who had just demonstrated remarkable speed and accuracy with a handgun. Charlie's nerve broke first, and he dropped his rifle with shaking hands. Jake tried to maintain his defiance. "You can't watch both of us. One of us will get you." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but you'll be the first to die. Is Henderson's money worth your life?" Jake looked at his wounded leader, who was moaning and bleeding profusely from his shoulder wound. The criminal partnership was clearly dissolving under pressure, and Jake decided that discretion was the better part of valor. All right, Jake said, dropping his weapons. "We surrender." Thomas kept his rifle trained on the 2 men while moving to free Mrs. Patterson. The elderly woman was shaken, but uninjured, and she helped him tie up the outlaws using their own rope. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Thomas asked as he cut her bonds. "I am now. Thanks to you," Mrs. Patterson replied with dignity despite her ordeal. "I don't know how you found us, I'm grateful beyond words. Thomas quickly explained his identity and his relationship to Catherine while keeping watch on the prisoners. Henderson was still conscious, but clearly in no condition to cause trouble, while Jake and Charlie seemed thoroughly cowed by their sudden reversal of fortune. "We need to get moving," Thomas said. "Catherine is waiting for us, and we need to put some distance between ourselves and this place." As they prepared to leave, Henderson managed to gasp out a threat through his pain. "You'll never get away with this, Mitchell. I have friends all through this territory. They'll track you down and make you pay." Thomas knelt beside the wounded outlaw and spoke quietly. "Henderson, you're a thief and a murderer, and your friends are no better than you are. But if you're smart, you'll take your partners and disappear into Mexico. Because if I ever see you again, or if you ever threaten Catherine or Mrs. Patterson, I'll kill you without hesitation." The sincerity in Thomas's voice clearly convinced Henderson that the threat was real. The outlaw nodded weakly and said nothing more as Thomas and Mrs. Patterson gathered supplies and weapons from the camp. Thomas retrieved Buck from where he had left him and helped Mrs. Patterson mount behind him. They rode quickly to where Catherine was waiting, and the reunion between the two women was emotional and heartfelt. Catherine had used her time alone to rest and clean her wounds as best she could. She was still weak and exhausted, but seeing Mrs. Patterson safe gave her strength and renewed hope. "What about Henderson and his men?" Catherine asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "Tied up and disarmed," Thomas replied. "Henderson is wounded, but will live. They'll eventually free themselves, but by then, we'll be long gone." Thomas made a quick decision about their route. Fort Bridger was still several days away through dangerous country, but there was a smaller army outpost called Pine Ridge Station much closer to their current position. If they could reach it safely, they would have military protection and medical care for Catherine. As they rode northeast toward the outpost, Mrs. Patterson told Thomas more about the attack on Morrison's wagon train and the days that followed. Her story filled in details that Catherine had been too traumatized to provide, painting a picture of brutality and terror that made Thomas even more grateful they had escaped. Morrison had indeed been embezzling money from his passengers, but he had also genuinely tried to protect them when Henderson's gang attacked. The wagon master had died fighting, trying to buy time for the non-combatants to escape. He was a flawed man, Mrs. Patterson said sadly, but he didn't deserve to die like that. None of them did. The other survivors who had fled west were probably dead by now, either killed by Indians or overcome by the harsh conditions of the wilderness. Catherine and Mrs. Patterson had only survived because Henderson needed them alive to find Morrison's hidden money. As they traveled, Thomas found himself studying Catherine closely. Despite her ordeal, she maintained the dignity and intelligence that had attracted him to her letters. She was concerned about others, grateful for rescue, and determined to help rather than simply being rescued. "Thomas," Catherine said as they paused to rest the horses, "I need to know something. In your letters, you painted a picture of frontier life that was challenging but hopeful. After what I've seen these past weeks, I have to ask, is this the kind of life you're offering me?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. Catherine deserved complete honesty about what marriage to him would mean, especially after her traumatic introduction to Western life. "Catherine, what you've experienced these past weeks represents the worst of frontier life: criminals, violence, and lawlessness. But that's not the whole picture. Yes, life out here is hard and sometimes dangerous. We face challenges that people back east never encounter. But there's also beauty, freedom, and the opportunity to build something meaningful together." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "In your letters, you never promised it would be easy. You promised it would be worthwhile. And I still believe that," Thomas said. "But after what you've been through, I'll understand if you want to return to Boston. I have enough money saved to pay your passage east and give you a fresh start." Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering but had not lost their warmth. "Thomas Mitchell, I traveled 2,000 miles to marry you and build a life together. A few outlaws and some hard traveling aren't going to change my mind now." Mrs. Patterson smiled at this exchange. "Mr. Mitchell, you found yourself a remarkable woman. Catherine never lost faith during our captivity. She kept saying that you would come looking for her, and she was right." Thomas felt his heart swell with emotion. Catherine's courage and determination were everything he had hoped for and more. The woman he had fallen in love with through letters was even more extraordinary in person. Late in the afternoon, they encountered their first sign of civilization since leaving Henderson's camp. Smoke was rising from a distant valley, and Thomas's experienced identified it as coming from a way station or trading post. "That's probably Willow Creek Station," Thomas said, consulting his mental map of the territory. "It's a supply stop for freight wagons and military patrols. We can get food and medical supplies there." As they approached the station, Thomas was relieved to see a small cavalry patrol watering their horses at the corral. The presence of soldiers meant safety and the possibility of escorting the women to a larger army post. The station operator, a grizzled frontiersman named Pete Carson, welcomed them with frontier hospitality and asked no uncomfortable questions about their appearance or circumstances. In the West, a person's immediate needs took precedence over their history. "You folks look like you've had some hard traveling," Carson observed. "Come inside and get some hot food in you. There's a room upstairs where the ladies can rest and clean up." The cavalry sergeant, a career soldier named O'Brien, listened to Thomas's account of Henderson's gang and the attack on Morrison's wagon train. His expression grew increasingly grim as he learned about the massacre and the outlaws' plans. "We've been tracking reports of bandit activity in this region," O'Brien said. "Your information confirms what we suspected. I'll send a patrol to investigate the scene you described and look for Henderson's gang." Thomas provided detailed directions to both the destroyed wagon camp and the location where he had left Henderson and his men. He also gave Sergeant O'Brien one of Morrison's money pouches as evidence of the outlaws' crimes. "Keep the money," O'Brien said. "It's probably stolen anyway, and you've earned it by bringing these criminals to justice." That evening, as Catherine and Mrs. Patterson rested upstairs, Thomas sat on the station's porch and wrote a long-overdue letter to Pete Hawkins in Silver Creek. The telegraph lines didn't reach Willow Creek Station, but Carson promised to include the letter in his next mail shipment. In his letter, Thomas explained everything that had happened and asked Pete to prepare the community for Catherine's arrival. He also requested that Dr. Williams, Silver Creek's only physician, be ready to examine Catherine for injuries and exhaustion. Most importantly, Thomas wrote that he and Catherine would be married as soon as she felt ready, either in Silver Creek or at whatever location she preferred. After everything they had been through, he wanted to make their union official and begin building the life they had planned. As Thomas sealed the letter, Catherine joined him on the porch. She had bathed and changed into clean clothes borrowed from the station operator's wife, and she looked more like the woman he had imagined from her letters. "Thomas," Catherine said, sitting beside him in the gathering darkness, "I want you to know that everything I wrote in my letters was true. My feelings for you, my hopes for our future, my willingness to face whatever challenges come our way." Thomas took her hand gently, mindful of her injuries and recent trauma. "Catherine, you've shown more courage in these past weeks than most people show in a lifetime. I'm honored that you still want to share your life with me." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast western sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they continued their journey to Silver Creek, but tonight they were safe, together, and looking toward a future they would build side by side. The long nightmare of separation, danger, and uncertainty was finally over. Thomas had found his mail-order bride clinging to life in the wilderness, and together they had survived their first test as partners. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as Catherine had written in her very first letter all those months ago. 3 days later, Thomas, Catherine, and Mrs. Patterson rode into Silver Creek under a brilliant autumn sky, escorted by a cavalry patrol that Sergeant O'Brien had assigned to ensure their safe passage. The small town had never looked more welcoming to Thomas, with its familiar wooden buildings, dusty main street, and the distant outline of his ranch in the foothills beyond. Word of their arrival had somehow preceded them, and a small crowd had gathered near Pete Hawkins Station. Thomas spotted several familiar faces, including Sarah Walsh, Dr. Williams, and Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who happened to be in town for his monthly visit. Pete Hawkins himself was waiting on the platform, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting in the sunlight, and his weathered face creased with relief. When he saw Thomas riding beside the two women, the old station master actually removed his hat and wiped his eyes. "Tom Mitchell," You did it, Pete called out as they dismounted. You actually found her and brought her home. Thomas helped Catherine down from her horse, noting with satisfaction that she seemed stronger after 3 days of rest and proper food at way stations along the route. Her color had returned, and though she still moved carefully due to her injuries, her spirit was clearly restored. Sarah Walsh immediately took charge of Catherine and Mrs. Patterson, fussing over them like a mother hen and insisting they come to her home for baths, proper meals, and medical attention. Dr. Williams, a kind elderly man who had been practicing frontier medicine for 20 years, quietly examined both women and pronounced them remarkably healthy considering their ordeal. Some cuts and bruises, exhaustion, and the effects of poor food and exposure, Dr. Williams reported to Thomas. But nothing that rest and care won't cure. Miss Hartwell is a remarkably strong young woman. The cavalry sergeant made his report to the local sheriff and arranged to send a more detailed account to Army headquarters. Henderson's gang would be pursued and brought to justice, though Thomas suspected the outlaws were already fleeing toward Mexico or the wild country north of the Canadian border. That evening, the entire town gathered at Sarah Walsh's home for an impromptu welcome celebration. Catherine, wearing a borrowed dress and looking more beautiful than Thomas had ever imagined, told the story of her rescue to a fascinated audience. She spoke modestly of her own role, but praised Thomas's courage and determination in terms that made him blush with embarrassment. I always believed he would find me, Catherine said, her eyes meeting Thomas's across the crowded room. Even in my darkest moments, I never doubted that Thomas Mitchell was the kind of man who would keep his promises. Mrs. Patterson, who had been invited to stay in Silver Creek as long as she needed, added her own testimony to Thomas's character. He risked his life for 2 women he barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. Catherine, you've chosen your husband well. Reverend Matthews, a jovial man who had performed more frontier weddings than he could count, approached Thomas and Catherine during a quiet moment in the evening. I understand congratulations are in order, the Reverend said with a smile. When would you like to have the ceremony? I'll be in town for another 2 days before continuing my circuit. Thomas looked at Catherine questioningly. They had discussed marriage several times during their journey to Silver Creek, but he wanted to give her time to recover from her ordeal before making such an important commitment. What do you think, Catherine? Thomas asked. Would you like to wait until you've had more time to settle in and get to know the community? Catherine's answer was immediate and firm. Thomas Mitchell, I've been ready to marry you since I accepted your proposal by letter 6 months ago. What we've been through together has only strengthened my resolve. The wedding was scheduled for the following Sunday, giving them time to make proper arrangements and allowing word to spread to neighboring homesteads and ranches. Sarah Walsh and several other local women immediately began planning a reception, while Thomas made arrangements to expand his cabin to provide more comfortable living quarters for Catherine. During the week before their wedding, Catherine insisted on seeing Thomas's ranch and understanding exactly what their life together would involve. Despite Sarah Walsh's protest that she needed more rest, Catherine rode out to the homestead with Thomas on a crisp autumn morning. Thomas watched nervously as Catherine examined his simple cabin, the barn he had built for his livestock, and the fields where he planned to grow crops and graze cattle. He had worked hard to build something worthwhile, but after Catherine's refined upbringing in Boston, he worried that his frontier home might seem primitive and uncomfortable. Catherine walked through the cabin slowly, examining the furniture Thomas had built by hand, the stone fireplace he had constructed, and the small touches he had added in preparation for her arrival. When she discovered the writing desk he had carved specially for her, based on descriptions in her letters, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. Thomas, it's perfect, she said simply. Everything you described in your letters, and more. I can see the love and hope you put into preparing this home for us. Over the following days, Catherine threw herself into preparations for their wedding and future life together. She worked alongside Sarah Walsh and the other women, learning about frontier cooking, food preservation, and the 100 small skills necessary for survival in the wilderness. More importantly, Catherine began to understand her place in the Silver Creek community. Frontier society was more egalitarian than Eastern civilization, and women's contributions were valued highly. Catherine's education and refinement were respected, but so were her demonstrated courage and practical skills. Mrs. Patterson decided to remain in Silver Creek rather than continuing her journey to Oregon. "At my age," she explained, "I'd rather build a new life with friends and chase an uncertain future with strangers." Sarah Walsh offered her a permanent home, and the two widows quickly became close friends. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with golden autumn light streaming through the windows of the small church that served Silver Creek and the surrounding ranches. Catherine wore a simple white dress that Sarah Walsh had sewn for the occasion, while Thomas wore his best suit and a new shirt that Catherine herself had made during the week. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, speaking about the challenges and rewards of building a life together on the frontier. The entire community was present, along with visitors from neighboring settlements who had come to meet the famous mail-order bride who had survived such an incredible ordeal. When Thomas and Catherine exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation. Their story had already become legend in the territory. The cowboy who had tracked his missing bride across hundreds of miles of wilderness and found her clinging to life but never losing hope. The reception was held at the largest building in town, with music provided by a fiddler who had traveled from Fort Laramie for the occasion. Catherine danced with Thomas, with Pete Hawkins, with Sergeant O'Brien, and with every other man present, charming the entire community with her grace and warmth. As the evening wound down and the guests began to disperse, Thomas and Catherine finally had a moment alone together as husband and wife. They stood on the porch of Sarah Walsh's home, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward their own ranch. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Mitchell?" Thomas asked, using Catherine's new name for the first time. Catherine smiled and took his arm. "I've been ready since I wrote my first letter to you, Mr. Mitchell. Everything that's happened since then has only convinced me that we're meant to face life's challenges together." The